operations and how it has changed over time. And then the attachment itself is in the board agenda item as well.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
All right. So, Lenita, do you want me to pull up the presentation and put it on the screen, or do you want to do that?
I've got it.
Oh, Eston's got it. Okay, Eston's going to pull it up, and then when you're ready, Lenita, go ahead and take it away.
All righty. Good evening, board members, Dr. Duty, community, colleagues. Today we have a full agenda on a variety of financial topics related to the budget. We will start as usual with the budget calendar. Today's budget discussion is the fifth budget discussion on the fiscal year 2022 budget. The fiscal year 2022 budget will also be discussed at the March 9th board meeting. The tentative adoption of the fiscal year 2022 budget is scheduled for the April 13th board meeting. The tentative budget will be posted on the district's website on April 14th, 2021. The final fiscal year 2022 budget and the tentative property tax millage rate is scheduled to be adopted at the May 12th board meeting. 3 public millage hearings will be scheduled after receipt of the preliminary tax digest, followed by the final adoption of the property tax millage rate in July. Okay. This slide contains definitions for some of the commonly used financial terms. This presentation will be posted on the district's website, and while reviewing the content of the presentation, it may be helpful to refer back to these definitions. Fiscal year 22 preliminary draft budget narrative. This presentation is a review of the preliminary fiscal year 22 budget and fiscal year 23-25 budget projections. All budget numbers presented are projections and subject to change based on several factors, including any future amendments that may be required for the current fiscal year 21 budget and the actual revenue and expenditures at year end for the current budget. Additionally, the state's final fiscal year 22 educational budget and federal grants may also impact the current and future budgets. The purpose of this presentation is to inform the Board of Education and stakeholders of the district's current financial condition and to develop the fiscal year 22 budget. Different scenarios, options, and considerations will be discussed. Please be mindful that this presentation is a draft and is considered preliminary at this phase. Next year's fiscal year 2022 revenue budget assumptions. The revenue projections are based on the following assumptions. 60% of austerity will be restored for fiscal year 21 through 25. Until we receive correspondence from the state indicating that the additional 40% will be restored, we will continue to operate under the assumption that only 60% will be restored. Property tax revenue and senior homestead exemption amounts are projected based on Georgia State University forecasts. The current senior homestead exemption tax impact is partially included in property tax revenue projection for fiscal year 22. Fiscal year 22-25 projected property tax revenue is calculated based on the proposed senior homestead exemption. Enrollment projections are based on enrollment projections report by Cooperative Strategies. QBE per student amount is calculated based on the fiscal year 2021 allotment sheet. Millage rate changes to maintain a minimum fund balance of 4%. So next we will go into the major revenue sources. This slide contains a list with brief definitions of the major revenue sources for the general fund, which includes property tax, which is the largest source of revenue for the district. One of the primary exemptions of property tax is senior homestead exemption. For next year, fiscal year 22, we are anticipating having 2 sets of senior exemptions. The current exemption, which expires at the end of the year, is for full exemption for 65 and older, and the proposed senior homestead exemption, which, if passed, will start in January 2022, and is for a 2-tier exemptions for seniors based on income and property value. Tuition. Tuition consists of funds received from tuition-paying students from birth to 12th grade. Other local consists of miscellaneous revenue, including transportation fees, earnings on investment, and sale of surplus property. QBE is the second largest source of revenue for the district and are funds received from the state based primarily on student enrollment. To participate in the QBE program, districts must contribute local taxes equivalent to 5 meals, or $5 for every $1,000 of property value. This is referred to as the local fair share. Austerity reductions is the amount of cuts the state has made to the QBE funding. If you will recall, the district's QBE funds were reduced by 10% at the beginning of the fiscal year. Since that time, the state has recommended that 60% of the original 10% cut be restored for current and next fiscal year budget. And then you have the state category, which consists of various state grants received, such as CTAE and JROTC. Property tax. On the previous slide, I referenced 2 homestead exemptions, the current exemption and the proposed exemption. If you will recall, I specified that the current homestead exemption will expire at the end of the year, and if the proposed exemption passes, it will begin in January. So to determine the impact both exemptions will have on the fiscal year 22 budget, I did an analysis of the property tax history collection. The first column identifies the month that the city collects the taxes. The second column indicates the date that we receive the revenue. And the third column represents the amount of revenue we receive for the specified month. I have highlighted in green the 2 largest collection periods for the district, which is received in July and January. July revenue represents tax revenue collected in June, and January revenue represents tax revenue collected in December. This means for fiscal year 22, the current home exemption will be in place for the largest collection period of July through December. Highlighted in yellow represent funds that are received from January to June, same time frame as the proposed homestead exemption. I took the average of the collection period from January to June, and as you can see by the amount and percentages on the side of each fiscal year, based on the trend, an average of 6% of revenue comes in from January to June. So for fiscal year 2022, 94% of the senior home exemption will fall under the current senior homestead exemption, and 6% will fall under the proposed homestead senior exemption. Hope that was clear. So now we will look at the projected cost of the senior homestead exemption. For the current fiscal year, which is fiscal year 21, the current homestead exemption was in place, which cost the district approximately $4.3 million. For fiscal year 22, as discussed, both the current and proposed exemptions will be in place. So if you will look at the second table, the calculations for the fiscal year 22 projections are shown. Take 94% of the current exemptions and 6% of the proposed exemptions to project the district cost of $4.4 million in exemptions for senior homestead exemptions for fiscal year 22. The projection for fiscal year 23 through fiscal year 25 are based exclusively on the proposed senior homestead exemption. So I hope you understand the calculation of the fiscal year 22 amount. Okay. In reviewing the major revenue sources, we also touched on the local 5 mil share. To understand better how the state calculates this amount and how I calculated fiscal year 23 through 25 projections, I have included this table of calculations. Every district is mandated to contribute a local share based on the revenue which would be generated by 5 mills of property tax, or $5 for every 1,000. When levied on the most recent equalized tax digest for the district, the equalized digest is calculated by the Department of Audit and sent to the school district in the fall. For fiscal year 20 through 22, numbers were calculated based on the Department of Audit equalized digest. Fiscal year 23 through 25 projections are based on a 7% increase, which represents the average increase between the fiscal years. The Department of Audit equalizes or adjusts the digest to 50% since this is a percentage the district bills. This is where you see the percentages highlighted in yellow, listed under from sales tax ratio study. This means that for fiscal year 22, the Department of Audit's study showed that the digest was assessed at 47.83% rather than 50%. Once the Department of Audit equalized or adjust the digest up to the 50%, the 5 mil rate is applied to 40% of the adjusted gross digest. I know that was a lot. QBE applies the 5 mil rate to 40% digest for all systems in the state, regardless of the district's levy percentage, which is 50% for the city schools of Decatur. Please note.
For a second, Lenita. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, please note that the 5 mil requirement is not a separate pot of revenue, but it's included in the same revenue collected from property tax. Okay, Dr. Duty.
I just wanted to make sure you point out, because there's a lot of percentages getting thrown around there. The complication for us is that in our system, in the city of Decatur, we use a 50% value for tax assessments, not a 40% value like is used in other parts of the state. So that's why it's a little bit more complicated how that calculation is done. But the idea is they do the calculation the way they do in order to make it fair for us and for other systems, regardless of what percentage we actually use locally.
Okay. The next slide is your fiscal year 2022 through fiscal year 2025 preliminary revenue projection draft. This is just your revenue. The first row lists revenue from property tax. The amounts are calculated based on the millage rate, which we will discuss in upcoming slides. Next, I have separated out the deductions from the current and proposed homestead exemptions. As you can see, for fiscal year 22, both exemptions apply. And for fiscal year 23 through 25, only the proposed senior homestead exemption applies. Next is revenue from tuition. For students paying tuitions from birth to 12th grade, the decrease you see in future years is based on graduation rate for those students in K-12. Other local is your miscellaneous revenue. QBE is your state revenue, which is based on the student enrollment numbers highlighted in yellow above. Next, you have your local fair share, which is the 5 mil or $5 per thousand of property tax that is deducted from your QBE state funding. Then you have your deduction for the 40% of austerity cuts that remain. If you recall, this number was initially 3.3 million. Finally, you have your revenue from the state grants. Again, do be mindful that our biggest source of revenue is property taxes, and the amount listed are determined based on millage rate. Next, we have our fiscal year 22 budgeted expenditures assumptions. So earlier we talked about revenue assumptions. Now we're going to talk about expenditure assumptions. The following assumptions were made regarding the fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 25 projected expenditures. All one-time amendments related to COVID have been removed. 0.75% increase to TRS is included in fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 25 benefits. Remediation programs are included in the fiscal year 22 budget and fiscal year 23 through 25 budget in a phase-out approach. Step increases are included in all fiscal year budgets. 1% cost of living increase is included in fiscal year 22, 1.5% included in fiscal year 23, and a 2% cost of living increase is included in fiscal year 24 and 25. Fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 25 expenditures calculated with a 2% increase for inflation and growth. Next, we will go over the major expenditure categories. Salary and benefits are the two largest expenditure categories and account for approximately 86% of the budget. Professional and technical services are for expenses associated with professional and contracted services. Building and maintenance and ground consists of repair and maintenance expenses. Travel and other purchase services include costs associated with travel, communication, and miscellaneous services. Supplies and equipment are operational costs required to effectively support the district. Fees and payments are costs associated with registration, professional membership, and various dues and fees. Transfer to other funds is for transfer of funds to support programs such as the school nutrition program. This is your fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 25 preliminary expenditure budget draft. This slide provides the preliminary expenditures totals for fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 2025. The next step is to balance the budget by ensuring that we have enough revenue to cover the expenditures. So in the next slide, we will include the revenue and expenditures together so you can see what millage rate is required to ensure we have the appropriate amount of revenue to support the expenditures and a fund balance within the board range of 4 to 15%. This is your full fiscal year 22 through fiscal year 25 preliminary draft budget, which includes both revenues and expenditures. I bring your attention to the orange highlight, which indicates the additional revenue needed from the fund balance in order to fund the major expenditure categories. I also bring to your attention the yellow highlighted row, which is the proposed millage rate. Below the yellow highlighted millage rate is your fund balance percentage, which the goal is to maintain the fund balance percentage between 4 and 15%. And looking at the first column of numbers, which is your amended 3 fiscal year 2021 budget, you see that we are anticipate ending fiscal year 21 with a 9.2% fund balance percentage, which is again within the 4 to 15% range. In the second column of numbers, which is your fiscal year 22 preliminary budget, the orange highlighted section shows that we need an additional 1.8 million in revenue in order to balance the budget and maintain a fund balance of 6.8%. This will require a millage rate of 23.10, which is highlighted in yellow under the fiscal year 22 preliminary budget. In the third column of numbers, which is your fiscal year 23 preliminary budget, the orange highlighted section shows approximately 1 million in parentheses. The parentheses indicates funds that will go back to the fund balance. This means that although there is enough revenue to support the expenditures, there is not enough to support the expenditures and maintain a fund balance above 4%. At the end of the column for fiscal year 2023, right above the yellow highlighted millage rate of 23.10, you see the projected ending fund balance of 6.9 million. Above that number is the beginning fund balance of 5.9. With the addition of the 1 million in parentheses, the ending fund balance increases to 6.9, which brings the fund balance percentage to 7.9%. Projections for fiscal year 24 and 25 follow the same pattern as fiscal year 23. You will also see the millage rate highlighted in yellow gradually decreases each year after fiscal year 2023. Please note that fiscal year 2023 through 2025 are extremely preliminary, and a lot can change from today to fiscal year 2023. However, these projections give us an idea of what the future budgets may look like. If the state restores the remaining 40% of austerity cuts in fiscal year 23 through fiscal year 25, we will be in a much better financial condition in the future. Next, we have a sample tax appraisal analysis. This is to give you an idea of what financial impact the increases in millage rates noted on the previous slide will have on property owners. The first column represents the current millage rate of 20.25. For property with a $600,000 market value, we will take 50%, which is $300,000, to determine the assessed value. We will then multiply the $300,000 assessed value by the 20.25 millage rate. For a house with a market value of $600,000, taxpayers are currently paying approximately $6,075 annually prior to the deduction of any exemptions. The second column, which represents next year's fiscal year 2022 budget, lists the increased millage rate of 23.1. For property with a $600,000 market value and $300,000 assessed value, that's the 50%, the millage rate of 23.1 would yield school taxes in the amount of $6,930 before the deduction of any exemptions. This would represent an annual increase from the current year to next year in school taxes of $855 before any exemptions. Since the millage rate for fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 2023 are the same, the financial impact for the district would remain the same. In fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025, as the millage rate decreases, so does the financial impact for taxpayers. Fiscal year 2024 decreases by $204 annually from the previous year, and fiscal year 2025 decreases by 126 annually from the previous year. So I hope I have made that clear. On the next slide, which we had a lot to go through. The next slide you have seen multiple times, and this just shows the history of the fund balance percentage of annual budgeted expenditures since 2009. As you can see, there is not a pattern. Fund balances are dictated by the economy and needs of the district. The current fiscal year 2021 took a big financial hit as a result of the decrease in funds from the austerity cut and COVID-related increases in expenditures. Ideally, the fund balance should not exceed 15%. The next slide, you have also seen multiple times. This slide shows you a history of the millage rate since 2010. And I also included the preliminary fiscal year 2022 millage rate of 23.10. The millage rate is similar to the fund balance in that there is no pattern, and the economy and needs of the district are the primary factors that drive the millage rate. Next, we have legislative priorities. We have legislative priorities for the current fiscal year 21 budget and for next year's fiscal year 22 budget. The legislative priorities for the current fiscal year 21 budget are the same as those discussed last month. 60% restoration of the austerity cuts, which equates to 1.9 million, and a one-time bonus for the current year to all school site personnel in the amount of $1,000 to be funded by the governor's office in the Georgia Department of Education. For next year's fiscal year 22 budget, the House is proposing that the 60% or 1.9 million in austerity cuts continue to be restored. Last month, we discussed Senate Bill 59, which proposes to reduce charter system supplements by reducing earnings for each full-time equivalent student from 3.8% to 3%. Well, today I am happy to say that this Senate bill has been removed from discussion and it is no longer under consideration. Next, we have our fiscal year 2022 staffing considerations. In order to operate more effectively and efficiently, the staffing needs are being requested. 1 health/PE teacher at Decatur High School, 2 positions upgraded in the finance department to align the job level of responsibilities with the position, 1 accounting specialist to manage and monitor position control and various accounting responsibilities, upgrade of an administrative assistant to HR specialist 1 to align the job level of responsibilities with the position, increase 2 district reading coaches from 190-day employees to 210-day employees to provide more support to instruction and core practices for equity, such as literacy. The total fiscal impact is approximately $195,400 annually, and this cost is not included in the fiscal year 22 preliminary budget that we just discussed. Next, you have also seen this slide several times. These are some budget considerations for increasing revenue, increasing the millage rate as described in the summary of your preliminary budget, and accepting tuition for non-resident students for K through 12th grade. Okay, next we have the board budget updates for the current budget. As discussed at last month's board meeting, the Department of Early Care and Learning has announced that they will fund one-time $1,000 bonuses for pre-K teachers and workers. As a result, the amount that will be needed from general fund to provide one-time $1,000 bonuses to those employees that do not qualify under the governor's proposal or the Department of Early Care and Learning proposal is approximately $81,000. The next slide identifies a preliminary list of positions that would require a one-time bonus from general fund. Although these positions support all schools in the district, they are not specifically assigned to a school and therefore do not qualify for the $1,000 bonus under the governor's office. Next, we will talk about Decatur Virtual Academy, which is being proposed for fiscal year 22. This slide lists 2 different scenarios for a virtual academy. Scenario 1 provides families with the same level of quality of virtual learning that is currently being provided, which includes daily live online classes. In order to provide this type of service, the staffing needs are 1 teacher per grade level, 7 specialty teachers, 1 teacher per middle school subject, math, ELA, science, and social studies, 1 teacher per high school subject, math, ELA, science, and social study, 1 administrator, 1 counselor, and 1 paraprofessional, 1 designated technology support person, and 1 administrative assistant. The total fiscal impact would be approximately $2.3 million. Scenario 2 is a scaled down approach in which courses provided are primarily asynchronous, with daily check-ins. Adjunct staffing will primarily be utilized. The number of students registered would be the driving force behind the costs. The minimum number of staff for scenario 2 would be 1 teacher at the elementary level and 1 teacher at the secondary level, 1 paraprofessional, 1 administrator, 1 administrative assistant. The total fiscal impact would be approximately $529,000. Next, we have budget challenges. Restoring 60% of austerity cuts for the current fiscal year 21 budget has been approved and is awaiting the governor's signature. Fiscal year 22, 60% restoration of austerity cuts is still awaiting approval. The district has expended over $2 million on COVID-related expenses, and this has had a direct impact on the district's fund balance. Although there is discussion on how public schools will be funded for fiscal year 22, there has not been any final decisions. And of course, the biggest challenge is operating in a pandemic and not being able to project what future expenses may be necessary to protect the well-being of staff and students. Dr. Duty, I hand the mic over to you.
All right, thanks, Lenita. Appreciate the much more thorough presentation. I know it takes a lot of time, but I hope that's more digestible for folks. There's a lot there, even with all that extra description. So a couple things I want to point out and just raise up some questions I have for the board. And I want to kind of go through, I'm just going to share a bunch of different questions just so you know kind of the scope of things that I'm curious what your thoughts are, and then we can go back through and hit on them individually. So one of the things I want to make sure you see that in order to try to bring the millage rate down a little bit from the last draft, we changed those cost of living adjustments. So originally we were trying to shoot for 2% across the board in addition to the step increase, but in this budget, as Juanita described, we went for 1% next year, 1.5% the following year, and then 2% after that. And so we kind of stepped into it. As you know, and Lenita mentioned, salaries are the largest expenditure we have. I think she said 81% or something like that. It's a huge percentage. So that one decision is more meaningful than any other decision we make of what we do there, okay? So that's one thing we need to talk about. Do we try to stick with that? Do we try to maybe ramp a little, like start a little lower before we ramp it up over more time? How do we want to approach the cost of living adjustments and steps? Or related to that, do we want to shoot for building up unspent balance a little slower? And so as you saw, we didn't hit the 10% right off the bat, right? We didn't hit the 10% till the end of that projection. And so are we comfortable with a lower fund balance and a longer time to build up? That's one way that we could reduce that millage rate a little further. And then we also need to talk a little bit about if there's anything we want to try to do this current year. And so there are things we could probably do this current year to cut some budgets in order to have a higher unspent balance at the end of this year that could then help fund some of those needs next year. So we need to talk a little bit about that. There's not huge opportunity, but there may be some, and I think every little bit counts. The other thing I'd like your thoughts are on, as Lenita shared, right now most districts are leaving the austerity reductions in as they project out. And as we know in the past, austerity reductions came and they stuck around for a really long time. And I think that's why most people are doing that. We don't have to project that way. We could assume that since the state is undoing the austerity reductions based on very strong financial returns, that is different, right? That we're in a different time than what we were in the past. And so the chances of those continuing may not be as great. But as Alina has shared, it does have a big impact when you have that $1.3 million in there every year. So I'd love your thoughts on that. I'd love to talk a little bit about the staffing requests we put in there. As you know, we're trying to improve some efficiencies and things, but those are things, again, it's spending money, right? And so we'd love to get your thoughts on whether that's money well spent, if you are supportive of that or not. I want to talk a little bit about tuition students. At one point, we had talked about if we were going to do it, maybe only start with like high school students, so that we're not making too long of a commitment. And so just to put it kind of in perspective, if you assume we accept about 15 high school students, that would bring in about $83,000, $84,000 of revenue. So just to put it in perspective, what that would bring in. And then for Decatur Virtual School, the two scenarios we put together there are kind of the limits, right? The first scenario is like the worst case of we can't repurpose any staff. We have to get all new staff to do these things in order to fulfill what we would anticipate would be a fairly significant demand of needing people at all grade levels in all subjects, okay? The second scenario is going in, kind of dipping your toe in to the whole thing of using a much more adjunct kind of perspective, using already built online courses from other entities. And so the first scenario would be more like truly attending Decatur schools, because it would be our teachers teaching the courses much like what they're doing right now virtually. The second scenario would be much more asynchronous, doing coursework on your own and like checking in with teachers. It wouldn't be the one-to-one instruction from one of our teachers. So I just want to get your thoughts on that as well. So those are some of the big questions, I think, that we still need to try to figure out where we are with those. The biggest one probably is cost of living adjustments and where our comfort level is there, and that can help us figure out kind of what we need to do in other areas. So cost of living adjustments, how we feel on unspent balance percentages and building that back up again, how we feel about including austerity reductions into the future, the staffing requests, the tuition students, and the Decatur Virtual Academy are some of the bigger things I would really like to get to. Plus, of course, any questions or comments you guys have about anything else. Just some light conversation.
Exactly.
You know?
Nothing too major. So let's start with, what was the first one?
Cost of living adjustments, I would say, is the biggest.
It seems like the second one's kind of a framing issue for how we answer the second one, right? Like how we deal and how we feel about spending money.
Yeah, it's exactly right. These all tie together. It's exactly right.
And I said in the last meeting in the discussion that I think that there's a strong argument for building up the fund balance over a few years, as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction to try to get it back in 1 year. And I kind of wrote down 3 and looked them up and made a call to a commissioner today. A, housing prices have gone up, not just around Decatur, but around Georgia, which means that I think we're going to get more bang for that millage rate than we probably have in the past. B, I think that, you know, the senior tax exemption, as we talked about, none of us want it to happen, but I think that the worst case scenario is it goes away completely, which would be horrible. But we are going to see, you know, more revenue in the next couple of years. And so we would kind of be responding in 1 year when a couple of years we would have more. And then third, I think you're totally right about not planning for the austerity, and that was down at the bottom, so we can kind of discuss that as well. But given that 50% of our 61% of our funds do come from local fair share and that sort of stuff, we are in a much better position than some other local school systems. Let's not mix words about it. And so maintaining those austerity cuts are not going to be possible, I think, for the Georgia system, given what's going on. I also kind of $71 a month for the average Decatur household, given the amount of people who are unemployed, does feel like a lot. For raising the millage rate, I would be comfortable with decisions that support a slow return of the balance, and less conservative approach that we've had in years past.
All right, thanks, James.
David, I was wondering, so if we did, because I was thinking about the slower, starting with the lower fund balance also. But are there scenarios that we could get in terms of, well, if we started with this, a fund balance here, then that would allow us to have a cost of living increase at this percent? Like, how can we look at that?
Yeah, so sorry. Let's go ahead and talk through some of those, like how you can kind of estimate those, okay? So for instance, if we know that our salaries currently in FY22 we're projecting at 52,250, okay? 52 million. Let's just say 50 million to keep it easy. So a 1% increase for the following year is going to increase that 1% of that 50 million. Okay? So what is that, 500,000? And so you can get a quick estimate of what each percent of that cost of living is going to do. And then similarly to that, there's the one slide that has what a tenth of a millage point is. And so each tenth increment is about 222,000. So if we're just really rounding around here, each 1% cost of living is about a 0.2 increment in the millage rate. Very, very rough, but it can give you kind of a rough feel for if, for instance, instead of doing a 1% cost of living adjustment, we did a 0.5%, that could probably lower the millage rate about 0.2. Okay? Very, very rough, but in general, when you're trying to put some scenarios together in your head, that's kind of how I think of it.
Do you have any more questions, Dana?
You go ahead. Thank you.
I think she said go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
Louis,
Ty.
did you have any questions?
I have a question. Yeah, well, first, I want to, well, I'll go back and say, as always, that I appreciate the presentation. I find, Lanita, that your presentations are just very clear, and I appreciate that. And I wanted to clarify or confirm that all the budgets presented included all of the mitigation programs that we discussed at the last meeting.
The remediation programs, yes.
What did I?
Yep.
Yeah, well, I said the wrong word, but that's what I meant. All right.
But just to clarify, remember, like the remediation idea of adding staff, they phase out over time. So that's what Lanita was talking about when she said they phased out. The greatest remediation expenses are in next year's budget, and then they go down from there.
Okay. I agree and appreciate James' sort of support for the idea of a slow build up, slow return to the fund balance. I assume that what we're talking about, because I think that budget had a target of 10%. Our policy says between 4 and 15. So I would assume that we would keep with the policy and target a 4% fund balance like for next year.
That's
I think
exactly
that
what I was talking about.
To me, that makes a lot of sense, and that's what we should do. That's what I would support. I also think pulling back on the COLA increases, I mean, under the circumstances, is the right thing to do. We just can't hit people with all of these costs at the same time. So I think that I believe that's the right thing to do. And I just made a list of the questions you asked. I don't know if you want to do it this way, but I wonder about incurring the costs for the virtual academy. As much as I like that idea, you know, a $2.5 million hit to the budget under these, you know, a 23.10 mil that's a hefty increase all at one time. And so under the circumstances, I would think that we need to think about the go slow approach on that. Unless, you know, the only, that's just what I think. The only way that I would think otherwise about it is if coming off COVID, there's a really strong reason to continue and build up the virtual academy now. And it could be that it's just a hit that we have to take. And we could talk more about that, but I would think that we do need to talk about it. Under the circumstances, I think we should see what we can cut this year. You know, absolutely. I don't know what that would be. I don't know what kind of bang for the buck we get. Bang for the buck. I think we should continue to assume that the austerity cuts will not be restored, just to be conservative, given history. I would strongly consider holding on any new staffing requests under the circumstances.
All right, thank you. And just to clarify, for one of the reasons we still have the Decatur Virtual Academy in here is because we do anticipate that there will be people who want to keep their children virtual come fall because of coronavirus-related reasons. There may be other reasons as well, but we anticipate, because we're hearing that, for instance, children probably won't be vaccinated or eligible for vaccines till summer. And we're just anticipating there will be folks who will want to remain virtual. So we will probably, unless we just say, no, we're not doing it, which I can't imagine us doing, we'll probably need some sort of virtual offering for those families that want to remain virtual. At this point, it's really hard to predict how large that will be because there's just so many unknowns between now and then. But I do anticipate at least some expense for virtual schooling in the fall.
From the way I look at it, if that's the case, I would put it in a different category of the kind of expense that you just have to eat, and it's a bad thing. But so if that's the justification for it, that's one thing. It's a different justification if this is just a new initiative that we're going to launch, right? And so
yeah, it's not that at all. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, before we leave that topic, one of the things we could do, because we're coming up on the time that people start registering for next school year, we could ask people to make their best decision that they can with the information available to them. Do you want to register your kid for a virtual school next year? And we could try to get some numbers around it. Obviously, families will be dealing with as much uncertainty as we are, but I bet some families would know at this point what they're thinking. We would probably want to have the option for them to change their mind at this point, because there is so much that can change between now and then. But that is one option. We could roll it in as we start doing registration for next year, have one of the options be move to virtual.
I think that's a good idea. Seems like such a big unknown. I mean, you know, we're already getting questions from people saying, are we going to be back in person next year? What is that going to look like? Can we answer that? Not really. I mean, we anticipate, I would say, being back in person, but there are so many things we can't control. And so I'm thinking of like all the what ifs, like what if we're still hybrid? What if we're, you know, I anticipate we'd be back in person and hopefully more kids in person because of teachers being vaccinated, and, you know, but there are very many unknowns, and hearing that school systems around us are planning for some sort of virtual option, it just seems like the prudent thing for us to do, that we have to be planning for that to be a possible necessity. But the kind of scale that we're talking about here, like in scenario 2, is a very low scale as compared to what we're even doing now.
It would be nothing like what we're doing now.
Right, and so, I mean, that's where I don't even know at this point, if asking that question, we would get reliable information, because it feels like there's just so many unknowns that I think we will know more in just even a couple months. Like, I'm hopeful that we will know that our teachers are getting vaccinated sooner than later, given what seems to be happening with, you know, the rollout, et cetera, and I just feel like the landscape is gonna change so dramatically. I do think we need to be planning for a virtual option. I was kind of looking at scenario one and thinking that one might be too robust, but maybe there's something in between here, because I'm thinking, you know, in scenario one, that would be ideal, but maybe we don't need to do all, you know, I'm just thinking maybe there's something in the middle there where we do have to budget for. Is this amount, and I was wondering, is this amount already in the budget?
No.
Either of these? Okay,
No.
so this is an additional cost.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, Lenita, but the Decatur Virtual Academy options are not in the budget.
Correct.
Okay, if we, let's just say hypothetically that we continued operating like we are operating now, is that in the budget, a hybrid like we're doing now?
Well, so let me tell, this question came up at Teacher Advisory Council, so let's talk briefly about fall, about
Yeah.
what I'm picturing for fall. So based on everything I know right now, all the different experts we've talked to, et cetera, what I told Teacher Advisory Council is I would anticipate fall will look somewhat like what past falls have looked like. That we will probably have more students in classrooms than we do now, probably very close to the same amount that we would have had in normal years. We will probably see some mitigation measures still in place. We will probably still have some kind of mask requirements, at least in certain situations. We will probably have some kind of other safety protocols and things of how we do lunch, how we do passing times, things like that. But it looks to me from, you know, we can only do so well reading the tea leaves, but it looks to me, based on all that I know, it will probably be somewhat normal. Now, that being said, I do anticipate a significant number of people still wanting to be virtual in that situation. But what I don't picture happening is having to do a hybrid schedule like what we're about to start at the high school. I don't picture doing half days. I don't picture doing 2 days a week. I picture 5 full days a week of anyone who wants to come in person, coming in person with some additional mitigation measures in place would be my best guess at this point.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yep.
Okay, so then it does make this seem like it could be a smaller scale option with, like we were saying, potentially growing it in future years.
And just to make clear too, I don't want it lost in the shuffle, this is kind of that scenario one. If we have a number of students that can be served by this, so for instance, if you have one teacher per K-5 grade level, that's that first line, right? If you have a number of students at, say, 3rd grade who can be served by one teacher, then this captures that, okay? If you have a lot more, you're gonna need more teachers. And so then you would have to go above this. Now, if you have a lot less, you may look to other solutions like combining the K and first graders together in a multi-grade class and having both grades at the same time with one teacher, right? And so there are solutions where you can kind of flex it a little bit. The other thing is, if these students are doing the virtual academy, they're not doing in-person schooling. And so if it comes to the point where enough students are doing this, we may be able to shift some existing resources into this that are not adding to the cost. So if the, 5th grade numbers are such that we can take one 5th grade teacher from Fave or Tally and move them virtually, that's not adding to our expenses. So this is kind of what we're picturing as a ceiling, assuming that we could meet the demand within those grade levels and those subject areas.
Which plays into the conversation we're having about tuition students.
Correct.
Because we might have tuition students who want to be virtual, and we might have tuition students who want to be in person. And so I was going kind of a different direction earlier with thinking about tuition students, because we had talked about wanting to reduce class sizes, and we're talking about taking on more expense to increase staffing and teachers to have smaller class sizes. So that seems counterintuitive to me. However, in this situation, there might be a need to round out classes virtually to make it cost effective if there is an opportunity to increase tuition students.
Possibly.
So I've come back around to kind of where I was last time, which is to say, personally, I would leave that at your discretion as to what makes sense.
Right.
Once we know the actual numbers, because it may or may not make sense. We wouldn't want to have to hire more teachers and actually lose money by accepting tuition students. However, we might want to like increase efficiencies to make a great program better and pay for itself. In like, for example, building a virtual program.
Right,
So,
okay.
okay. Yeah. Back to the conversation about the COLA adjustments, I've always, wanted to see us increase teacher salaries wherever possible. I like what we've been doing to become more competitive and to have good retention, keep great teachers. I feel like it's such a big variable, but so is assuming we will have austerity cuts still.
Right,
I almost wonder if we tie the two together, like assume worst case scenario, this is what we have to do in order to be fiscally responsible. But if we do get more restoration of austerity cuts, I would like to see it, like maybe that be first priority. Like if this assumption of austerity cuts continuing proves to be false, then that's what I would want to restore.
right, okay.
And I also, and/or also, the millage rate is kind of the third leg of the stool there, where I think it's a priority to keep our programs and school systems strong, and having to shift, like if we're not getting money from the state, having to shift that temporarily to a modest, not a large, but modest millage increase could be reasonable if it's temporary, and we see, like we see things after 2022 potentially restoring austerity cuts and/or the cost of the senior exemption going down. That would then allow us to bring that millage rate down like we were projecting. So, so I see those three things like kind of like a three-legged stool.
Yeah,
The biggest unknown right now being the austerity cut to that. What's going to happen there? Yeah, so just, I just see more or less a direct correlation between the two, whether we get money from the state and whether we can then afford to do more for our teachers.
right?
What would the millage, or what would the fund balance potentially be if we did not raise the millage this year?
I think we actually have that in the
We have
previous
that
one. Let me find it real quick.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
What would the fund balance be if we did not increase the millage rate next year?
And
We
keep
can
all the
actually send
expenses the same?
Yep.
But I almost feel like we have to fold in the $500,000 assumption for some sort of virtual option, because I don't think there's an option to not have an option. Is that, or is that? Yeah, so I feel like that, I think I want to see that in the budget, to be able to plan for it, because I just don't think it's going away.
While she's looking for that,
Yeah, I got it right here. So
Okay.
basically, I just did a quick calculation
Okay.
using the 222,666 per tenth of a mil.
Mm-hmm.
So that increase from 20.25 to 23.10 generates $6.3 million of revenue. And so that 6.3 would come off of that projected ending fund balance, so we would be in a deficit.
Deficit, okay.
Yes, you're right. It would be negative 0.5%.
Yep.
Good job, Dr. Duty.
Thanks.
So it sounds like we have to raise the mill, maybe not necessarily to 2310, but.
I mean, the only other option if we didn't raise the millage rate would be to cut significant expenses.
Right.
Can you, I mean, just do that same quick calculation if we raise the millage rate to achieve 4% fund balance instead of 7?
Okay,
Yeah.
give me a minute.
Let's race, Linnea. I have that we'd have to increase the millage 1.1.
21.3?
We'd have to go from 20.25 to 21.35 to have a 4% ending fund balance.
A lot more tolerable.
But that's not including the $500,000 cost of the virtual, right?
Correct. So a $500,000 for virtual would add another 0.2,
Yeah.
basically.
But I feel like we've said we have to have that, so I feel like, you know, I wanna hear what the rest of the board feels, but I feel like we need to fold that in, because I don't see a way right now where we could, unless we're saying we're just not gonna offer a virtual offering next year, but that doesn't seem feasible, maybe,
Right.
just given the current situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I
It seems
feel
like
like
there's Yeah, sorry.
we might need to budget for that.
There's a difference
Yeah, so
between,
basically, oh, sorry, James, go ahead.
when I saw the presentation, it was like B is setting up the structure for a totally different virtual academy as opposed to virtual instruction, which would be covered by the QBE, et cetera, of the students who chose to go virtual, correct?
Yeah, B is a very different solution. If we want the virtual experience to be similar to what we're doing now and to be similar to what kids experience in our classrooms, then
Sure.
we would have to go with A or a version of A, right? So we're probably talking $1.5 to $2.5 million, most likely. Now, again, there's so many variables there in terms of, can we repurpose some teachers from an in-person classroom to a virtual classroom and thereby not increase cost, right? There may be opportunities for that, but if we would want kids to have a similar experience to what they would have in a classroom, then we're talking at least $1 million, even if you're not looking at, even if you assume you can repurpose most of the staff, you still have close to $1 million of expenses because you're not going to be able to repurpose everybody. Does that make sense?
But the students go away. So in theory, if there were 100 K-2 students in Decatur who chose to stay virtual, they'd be leaving the classroom and taking 3 teachers with them, right?
Correct, and the key being in theory, and the reason I'm saying I doubt that'll happen is because the kids don't ever come in those nice, neat little packages. They don't all come from the same spot, right? So you may have a couple kids in one grade at one school and a couple other kids in another grade at another school, to the point that it's not actually, you're still gonna have to host those same classes you would have hosted before they moved virtual, because you're not losing enough kids at a given grade level at a given school to offset an entire class worth of students, is my guess.
Yeah, it's
What
kind of
is-
the inverse of what we were trying to figure out with when we had the learning cottages
Yeah.
and stuff, you know.
What is the, let's see, the kids below what age are not going to get vaccinated? Is it, how old do you have to be before you're,
Right now it's
Oh.
18.
I thought 16-year-olds could get vaccinated.
16-year-old get what?
I don't know off the top of my head, Louis.
I guess my question obviously is whether,
Age will not be vaccinated, like where's the cutoff?
Oh,
I'm wondering if all of our kids, you know, if there were a grade level thing, you know, so that it's kids or I mean, does this presume that we have a train wreck in vaccination rates, or is it more the fact that the kids currently just simply aren't eligible and therefore some younger kids won't be vaccinated and stay home? Or does it have more to do with just shifting preferences based on the experience to date and people kind of want to keep it up? I mean,
I think a lot of it is that last one, Louis. I think a lot of it is people that will be very nervous still in the fall sending their kids to school, regardless of the state of vaccinations. And that if they had a virtual option, that's what their preference would be. That's my guess. Not as much as us saying we really have to have a virtual option, more us accommodating our stakeholders who feel they need to have a virtual option would be my guess.
And our size as a school district makes this more difficult. And so I'm just thinking, are there partner opportunities? Does the state of Georgia, you know, virtual academy, is that something we could leverage, or do we?
Well, so we would lose them as students at that point. So the idea is, do we want to keep them as our students
Okay.
and keep the funding that comes with them as students, or do we want to lose them to another program?
Okay. So that wasn't really a partnership like I was thinking.
No.
All right. Okay. Well then I guess it's back to my question is, what if anything should we build into the budget for the virtual academy? Because it's a significant amount of money, and it sounds like we need to have it in some form. But we don't know how exactly robust it will need to be, or for how many students, or whether we'll be able to shift any teachers. But it sounds like there's going to be some cost. Most likely, there's going to be some cost. And so what should we build in?
So kind of related to some of the other conversations.
Mm-hmm.
If we are aiming for a fairly low unspent balance, so if we are redoing things like we were talking about a little bit ago and saying, okay, next year let's shoot for 4%, that also means we have to be more careful about our other estimates, right? Because we are taking out any margin for error in our estimating. And so in that case, I would say we need to also be cautious then with our projections of the virtual school side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, we probably should budget $2 million, and hopefully we don't need it all. But if we budget $500,000 and it costs $2.5 million, we now have to take that $2 million out of unspent balance that is already as low as we want it to go.
Yeah.
And so because it's so unknown, I would feel really uneasy budgeting anything less than about $2 million. And then if for some reason the demand is much higher, the higher the demand gets, the more likely we can repurpose existing staff into those virtual positions, because you'll have more people. And the more people you have, the more likely you can shut down entire classrooms, basically repurpose a classroom so that that person can now teach virtually. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I also think it's going to be, families are going to want to know what kind of instruction it's going to be.
Correct.
Because it could impact their decision. So this is like a chicken or the egg kind of thing. Because if my option is virtual, totally asynchronous, and I know that's probably not going to work for my kid, then I would, maybe lean toward going in person. Or if I knew that it was going to be at the high interactive level with a lot of synchronous teaching that it is now, then I would be more likely to do it. So at what point do we have to say this is the type of virtual instruction we are planning to provide, to then, inform people enough so that they can make a decision?
Yeah.
And not, we have to set expectations.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I guess what I would say is we need to make that decision right off the bat and say, if we're going to offer a virtual option, it needs to be a virtual option that meets the standards of City Schools of Decatur, right? And that if your child is taking that virtual option, they will have a very similar experience to what they would have had if they came in person. I don't think our stakeholders would accept anything other than that. And I think frankly, if we didn't want to do that, we might as well just have them unenroll in our district and go to Georgia Virtual School or something and get the much less experience, right? So I think if we're going to do it, we should do it, right? And do it the way that we would want to do it, up to standards. So that would be my 2 cents, because I do think people are going to want to know those details, and they are going to want to know what it actually looks like, and that's the way I would lean.
I agree, David. I think that we have to maintain the standards that we have now for our in-person instruction. We know that there has been a lot of conversation about differences between in-person instruction and virtual right now. And so I would like to really consider your suggestion in terms of budgeting on the high end so that we are prepared. And I was trying to say it earlier, I was on mute, but Louis, the age I see is 16. So that's still, could potentially be a significant number of students, depending on what happens with the vaccine. Hopefully there are no other, crazy weather things that, delay
Right.
shipments and things like that. And so, so I would like to see that. And I wish we could kind of do it like we did the homestead exemption, is like look at different scenarios in terms of if we kept the millage at, or if we set the millage so that we were at 4%, and if we budgeted 2 million for the virtual academy, then what would that allow us to do in terms of a cost of living increase? Like if we had these different, scenarios like we did with homestead exemption to give us, some scenarios to compare.
Yeah, totally. And we can definitely do that. If we can narrow down like what you just did and say, like, here are the 1 or 2 or 3 variables we're interested in, what are some scenarios that we could manage to do, and bring that back to you, for sure.
And I'm leaning more towards, maybe just for this first year, maintaining a 4 to 5% fund balance instead of trying to get up to the 6.8. I think that $70 a month will be a big hit to a majority of our community members. So I kind of did the math. If we could do it around the 21.35, then that would be approximately $27 a month. So we would have that increase, then maybe potentially do a 0.5% for COLA, just the first year, and kind of step that up, go 0.51, 1.5 like you had it. And then take into consideration the tuition. And would we be open to potentially opening that up to middle school as well?
For the tuition?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little, because, I mean, the big variable with what we do with the ability to bring tuition students is what commitment are we making to those students, right? And so I do think it's interesting if we have this virtual option that people could tuition into. I would imagine some people would, right? Are we making a commitment to a first grader who tuitions into either virtual or in person, if we have that as an option? Are we really saying we're going to commit to through 12th grade, right? So that's why we talked about starting just at high school, because in the past we have, right? We had tuition students.
Right.
When we shut it off, we let them finish, right? And so for some of them, they were very little, right? And they've continued on through the years. Do we want to continue that practice? I think one difference is those folks, when the tuition got shut off, my understanding is when they started as tuition, there was no indication that there was not going to be tuition in the future as an option. So the compromise was, if you're here, let you stay, right? The alternative would be, we open up for tuition, we maybe make a 2-year commitment and say, if we accept you, we'll let you stay at a minimum 2 years. We can't guarantee beyond that, right? Or something like that. That takes out some of the variability and allows us to offer it for more students, but it also then provides less certainty for those who go that route. So I do think we need to talk about that piece of, if we accepted tuition students, because it impacts the answer to your other question, Tasha, which is, could we look at middle school also? You know what I mean?
Right, and I was just wondering from that standpoint, I think our elementary and especially our 4-5 has been kind of to the brink, and so I don't even know if we could,
Yeah,
you
no,
know,
that's a good
essentially,
point.
you know, talk, but with the renovations at the high school and the middle school, it does give us a little more capacity, and the commitment isn't as long, or you could even say, this is a middle school commitment, that's another way you could say it, because that's gonna be a natural break anyway. And so, you know, we could say, you know, we're offering middle school, we can't guarantee that they'll be able to go into high school on the tuition program, but, you know, this is what we're offering, and then we have the high school, and then if you come in high school, you can finish out the high school. And then we can just adjust that every year. But I was just wondering, that could maybe add to the pool of the tuition without necessarily kind of messing with the K-5, which tends to be a lot more, you know,
Yeah.
stable,
Especially
higher numbers.
especially 3-5.
Right, oh, especially the 3-5, yeah.
3-5 has been there hasn't been a lot of slack there.
So,
I think it'd make a lot of sense to commit like by building, right? So, you know, if you can finish out at the high school or finish out at the middle school. You mentioned earlier about people who start tuition, who come in for our virtual program. I wouldn't want to make a commitment. I would not, I think that would be an appropriate distinction, that I don't see the need to provide that commitment to students who come to us virtually. It just seems like it's not necessary to me.
Okay.
Or at least not guarantee that it will, I mean, there's that, and then there's also the question, are we guaranteeing virtual instruction the entire time? Or
We can't do that, right?
So one thing I'll say to what I'm hearing, I'm trying to think of this through the lens of the student. I think the best thing for the student is to not put an end date to their life experience and friendships and being able to progress with their class, because I think that could be very disruptive. If you have an 8th grader who all of a sudden that doesn't want to leave but has to leave, and you're separating that kid from their friends at that age, looking at it through the lens of the student, I would have to say I would only support taking on tuition students if they could stay for as long as they want.
So once they came, they could stay together.
Yeah. And if that means that it doesn't make sense to accept them, then that would be my personal stance on that. I know it's tricky. For example, our freshman class, I think it is what, 450? Our senior class is 300. Our junior class is 300 something. So there might be those grades where it does make sense to accept, to round things out. But personally, I would only want to take a student if they could stay and finish out.
Right.
So I was wondering, because Tasha gave us some variables, should we come up with a couple other scenarios or different variables that David could bring back to us to consider?
so what have you kind of written down as maybe kind of?
I mean, so what I see is, so one variable is the fund balance, right? What percent fund balance. One variable is including the Decatur Virtual Academy and what impact that has on the fund balance. Of course, the main variable for all of these questions is millage rate, right? What would the millage rate be that would achieve those different things? So I had one more written down.
I think that was the only 3 kind of.
Oh, the cost of living adjustments, did I say that already?
No,
The
you
cost of
didn't.
living adjustment would be the other variable of like what it would look like. So cost of living, fund balance, and kind of that budget for Decatur Virtual Academy and how those impact millage rates together in their various combinations. That's kind of what I was picturing.
Mhm.
What is the
I mean-
digest growth that we've expected or projected?
Say that again?
What is the projected digest growth for these scenarios?
For percentage wise, I mean, the digest growth came right from the study from GSU, so I don't think it's necessarily a percentage-based growth. I'm not exactly sure what their methodology is. Remember that study we did with the city to project future property tax revenues? I'm not familiar with what their methodology was. It's whatever they projected.
But interestingly, due to, COVID and its effect on the rate, that has, I think, potentially increased the cost of homes. I mean, I know Heather and I both are in that business, and so people are offering way more for homes than they're even listed for. So when do we find out from the city what that actual number is on the property taxes portion of this?
Lenita, can you remind me when we get a property tax digest?
It usually comes in around May.
Okay, so
Yeah.
around there. And what are we projecting from this school year to next as far as an increase in that?
Well,
Or is it
so-
about the same? Or how does it the same?
Do you have the raw numbers, Lenita? Because this is one of the challenges when you look here, it takes the millage rate into account.
Into account,
And
right,
so
right.
It's a little harder, you have to kind of go back to the raw numbers. So you're wondering, like, what percent increase are we projecting if the millage rate holds steady from this fiscal year to next fiscal year,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's.
We may have to calculate that. I don't know if you have that already, Lenita, or do we need to calculate that and get back to them?
I don't understand, what's the question again?
So if the millage rate were to be held steady next year, what, percent increase are we projecting in tax revenue? So basically, what percent are we projecting the total tax digest to increase from FY '21 to '22?
Okay.
I remember Susan used to be very, conservative in that number. It would be like, 3% or something, and then we get it back, and it was actually 6%.
Right, and so that's one of the reasons we hired GSU, is because
Right.
we didn't want to be the ones guessing at those things. We
Mhm.
wanted the experts to say, here's what we think it's gonna be.
Right.
But also the first Decatur tax bill, isn't it based on last year's value because they haven't reassessed yet? So it could change when we get the second bill but it should be,
So it would
I believe
be, right,
it's
it'd be
based on
fairly
last year's.
the same, the
right, the first,
first half of the school year. What was that slide she did with the yellow and the green?
Yeah.
There,
I understand that though. I mean, year over year, we've historically always had an increase. Hadn't always been the
Right.
same, but so,
by the end,
So I'm just wondering what we're seeing in the industry, if the increase that we're currently taking into consideration is reflective of what's kind of going on in the market right now.
yeah,
Right.
will the
Well, it's-
assessments reflect the market?
There could be potential increase there, and we'll know by May, so I mean, that's not that far off.
that's why I
Well,
asked the question.
I just channeled Garrett and did some back of the napkin math.
All right,
And I think that the increase from '21 to '22 is about 5.8%,
oh, okay,
holding millage rate steady,
okay.
so.
And that's about what we've increased year over year, like 6%.
Yep.
And I feel like it might be higher than that this next go around. But, okay. That's interesting.
I was wondering, are we in agreement that we want to keep the fund balance at 4%? We want to try to do the fund balance at 4%. And then, so I was wondering if we could lock that down. And then are we in agreement that we should budget, like David suggested, 2 million for the virtual academy? And then we lock that in, and then we can discuss different scenarios in terms of the millage rate and the COLA, right?
I think that goes back to your suggestion, Jana, of having some different scenarios, because if we do all agree that we want to be at the 4% fund balance, we might not be able to pull off the 2 million for virtual schools. So maybe he would show us the scenario of, if we do the 2 million for virtual school, then we would maybe have to do a 5% fund balance. If we're gonna do just the 4% fund balance, then that would look like maybe 1.2 million to virtual school. Like, those are kind of the scenarios you were asking about for him to kind of put together, so we know whatever we decide on, what that could potentially look like, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I guess what I'm picturing, so to your point, Jana, if we can just say, hey, we're all comfortable with this, that definitely makes it easier, right? So if we wanna say, hey, 4% perfect, let's set it, right? 4% what we're gonna shoot for, that's now not a variable, right?
Right.
That will make fewer scenarios, that we could then present. So if you guys, if you know that there's anything you want to, that you think we agree on, like, okay, let's shoot for 4% next year, we can then take that away as a variable and have fewer scenarios to look at. And to your point, Jana, if we say yes, if we need to do a virtual academy and it needs to be like a Decatur style virtual academy, so we are going to include $2 million period, that variable is now gone. You know what I mean? So then we can start figuring out, so then at that point, the big remaining variables is what millage rate are we comfortable with? So like some scenarios of millage rates, and then what does that equate to in what we could do for cost of living?
So that's what I was thinking, because I'm wondering, based on what you said, if we could do a Decatur style virtual for less than 2 million, like if that has to be kind of what we know we have to be prepared to take on, and to be consistent with what we offer. And then, like you said, the scenarios may be different in terms of the millage and the COLA.
Yeah, I would be amazed if we could do it for less than 2 million.
Dr. James had, kind of some good points in the very beginning, kind of going back to some of what he was talking about with the, whether or not to assume the austerity cut. If we are going to budget at a 4%, which is our minimum, then I would only feel comfortable doing that if we assumed that we were not getting, the austerity restoration more than what we are getting.
60%.
Right, yeah.
And I would say that our other assumptions that are more conservative would have to remain more conservative if we're gonna budget that low, because that's starting to make me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I guess to answer Jana's question then, are we in agreement that at least the variable of the 4% fund balance is going to be the constant variable? I agree that.
For next year.
For next year, and I'm okay with that.
Are you guys all okay with that, shooting for 4% next year? And then the other thing we try to do is, any increase in millage, we try to even it out over the years, or at least reduce it, right? And so, what we would do is we'd aim for 4% without having wild swings in the millage rate. So if that means aiming for 5%, but keeping it much more stable over the 5 years, we would do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So are you all comfortable with that approach in terms of fund balance?
I think that makes sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and, you mean like, that would mean having a slightly higher fund balance, but being more consistent.
Exactly.
I feel more comfortable with that.
So when we do these, we try to keep those kind of together, right? Get to your goal, but also don't give the taxpayers whiplash
Right,
with changing millage rates too significantly.
agreed.
Agreed.
And then, we can talk about our priorities for assuming that at some point when the austerity cuts are fully restored, our goals are getting the COLA back to where we want it to be, getting the fund balance back to where we need it to be, and then reducing the millage rate
Right?
back to where, we think it should be.
I was wondering, do we need to clarify if we are all in agreement on virtual academy, and then, scenario A or scenario 1 or 2 for, because I think that's important for us to determine if, like 2 is really not even an option. Because we want to keep those students and give everybody the same level of education. And then we have to deal with it. What would it look like for the to do option 1, at different budgets? That makes sense.
I am I totally agree that virtual is something that is here to stay, and that there are members of Decatur who are going to want to approach 21, 22 with a virtual option. The 3% of our total budget on it gives me a good bit of sticker shock. I would love to see how that's broken down, given that those students would also get QBE funding, those students would also get, all the things that go with it. And then I would also prefer that we start with like some community feedback, like who in the system would want to go virtual, would want to commit to it for the whole school year. Because if it's 20% of Decatur, 2 million is underselling it. And if it's 3% of Decatur, then that seems about right. Does that make sense? And I think a lot of people already know where they are with that. And it may be something where, now that we've settled on 16 already, and Jane, I also Googled it, and I apologize for saying 18. If it's 16, then maybe the high school, that you'll get very little, and maybe with the lower elementary, you'll get a large number of parents who want to take advantage of it, so that would be part of the proposal we would want to light up. And I'd like to see that written earlier rather than later as part of the, if you were asking for me to give a stamp to something for $2.5 million, I'd like to see a lot of detail, basically, is what I'm saying.
Well, and I totally agree, and I think this is one of those chicken egg scenarios again, right?
Yeah.
Where in order for people to make an informed decision, you have to have details. In order to have details, you have to know who wants it and how many. And so some of it we will have to just make our best guess based on what we know about Decatur and Decatur families and the needs and whatnot. And so maybe it's kind of an iterative process, right? Like, we can kind of picture what it would take, which is what they put together in the presentation here, to do a Decatur-style virtual academy. We can then share with families, this is what we picture happening. If that's what we had, would you want to enroll your child virtually? And then we could have a much better idea of how many people to expect. I do agree with that.
I
would need a full year commitment though, because you can't hire these teachers for someone who just wants to stay virtual for the first 6 weeks to see how the start of the year goes. So
correct, and so we're picturing this as it's just like you're enrolling at Winona Park. You're enrolling in virtual school.
Right.
And
But
it's for the year.
What will happen when families say, virtual school, I thought it was gonna work for my kid, but it's not,
Yeah, it's a good question, because, so, for instance, if we had a situation where a family had to move school, right?
Right.
We would say no, because you live where you live, and that's where you attend, right? The virtual school will be much more like a magnet school environment, where do you let the kid go back to their other school? And most likely, it would be if there's space for them, and we have room in a given classroom at that grade level, then yes, we could accommodate them.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't, we may have to say, no, you're in the virtual school, and we can, when we do our, planning for next year, you can return.
Right,
You know what I mean?
all that would have to be very clear, especially if we accept tuition students.
Correct.
Who enroll in the virtual, say they're gonna be virtual, and then decide, no, actually, I need to go to a concrete school, then that's same, but even one step further.
Yep.
Well, and at least we've had an experience of basically a year of doing this, and so I think parents have somewhat of a good idea if their kid can thrive in this environment or not, because I think a lot of kids are. I mean, one of mine doesn't like it, and one of mine is doing fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of those things. I think at least now, since we've been doing it for a while, parents should have a little more idea of if this is something we could do for a whole school season. So I would lean toward making sure it was a robust program. I don't think we can offer it to our community without it being, similar to what they would be receiving if they were in person.
Well, one thing we can do is kind of run some scenarios. Like I'm picturing in my head, there's kind of a break-even point at which you go from the, you have to have the additional resources to you can repurpose existing resources. In my head, I'm picturing there's kind of a break-even point there somewhere, right? I think that you probably can accommodate students at the secondary level faster without additional cost than you can at the elementary level, because we have so many elementary schools.
Yeah.
And if they're pulling from all of those schools, it's gonna take quite a few kids before at any given school, at any given grade, you've pulled enough kids to reduce how many classes you offer.
Mhm.
For my part, I think I aligned myself there with James' comment, which is that it's just such a big number that to commit now, not really understanding the need. It just seems too much too quick, and that I would like to see more details and more sort of market testing, basically, to find out, I mean, it's, and people get mad every time we ask them a question because they think we're making a commitment to whatever they've selected. But I think that if we're very clear, we don't know what's going to be offered, and we're trying to find out, we're trying to test the waters to find out what people might be wanting to do, and put some options out with all kinds of disclaimers. I feel like we need to know that before that's a whole mill that we're in a climate we're already talking about 23 mil, an extra mill on top of that. And that's a very high tax rate that I just makes me queasy.
No, and I think that's an important disclaimer of figuring out, because that is what happens. As soon as we ask for input, people think a decision has been made when exactly the opposite is what's happening. And so we can talk through how can we gather that input and do our best to make it crystal clear that this is in order to allow us to make some decisions, not that we're making commitments. Let us think through that a little bit of how we could do that, because it's going to have to happen pretty quickly in order to actually help us with this process. So we'll think through what that looks like.
Okay.
Any other thoughts? I heard two different opinions on the austerity cuts for FY 23 to 25. Any other thoughts on whether we go the conservative route and leave them in, or we go the less conservative route and take them out, assuming the austerity cuts will not continue? Any thoughts on which direction to go there?
I think I was the voice that academically, but I thought Heather nailed it. If we're going to go 4%, I think we need to assume that they're going to stay in place, at least for next year.
And my question is really for the following years. I would not want to take it out for next year because I think it's almost a sure thing.
Okay.
My question is more for the following years.
There's also no consequence to leaving. It's just conservative budgeting to leave them in, but so that, we can see right there how much money.
So it may lead us to assume we need a slightly higher millage rate because we try to level it out a little bit. And so it's quite possible the whole thing will have to be slightly higher because those are in there. And then we find out later they're not there, so now we could have gone for a lower millage rate at the start. Does that make sense? So they're kind of connected.
It's hard to say, but maybe we phase it like we phased out our enrichment and remediation program. I mean, that might be our best guess, and then so that we're sort of meeting in the middle there.
I mean, I would feel very comfortable with that approach. I think the 10% cut at the start of the year was a very knee-jerk reaction of, we have so many unknowns, we've got to do something drastic. And that quickly, they already have seen they didn't have to do it so drastic, and so they're restoring it. My guess is that absent some other financial crisis, we probably will continue to be in a good position, and the chances of it remaining those 5 years, I think, is fairly low, unless somebody sees it as a way to just fund schools less, right? So it's possible it just becomes a political football, and nobody wants to put that money back because they want to use it somewhere else. But in terms of the economics of the state, I don't think there's indication that it would need to remain. So, I mean, personally, I would be very comfortable saying, you have to leave it in next year and then start phasing it out the 3 years after. I think I personally would be very comfortable with that if you guys would be.
Yes, because we'll have time to react if we need to.
Correct.
So.
Are you guys okay with that approach?
I'm good with that.
Okay.
I don't think we got into the staffing requests as much, but I'm thinking just for this first year, probably No.
Yeah, so let me ask, with the staffing request, what do you think about, doing something kind of in between? And maybe, because there are some positions that I would like to balance out that probably should have been addressed in the past. So maybe address, like the changing of like specialist coordinator, those kind of things. Maybe hold off on adding an accounting specialist. We don't really have any choice about the PE teacher for the most part unless we put health and PE back in the middle school and take out options. That has been years in the making that we've had to figure out what to do with that. So that one, if we don't fund the health PE teacher, that's gonna be complicated.
But we have PE, like PE in 8th grade, does that replace PE?
Right, but what happens is that that in the past has come off the high school staffing. I'm trying to remember, I may be saying this wrong. The PE teacher that does health at the middle school was funded off the high school staffing, but the high school didn't have enough staffing to fund it. So there was this deficit there because this position was teaching high school classes at a middle school level. It wasn't getting accounted for correctly.
So is this person being put at the high school, or is this to fund that position at the middle school?
I don't remember exactly which direction it's going.
But it's filling a deficit, is what you're saying.
Correct.
So there's not really an option to not fund it, okay.
And then the reading coaches, that kind of goes along with our remediation efforts of making sure we have enough time with our reading coaches. So I guess my preference would be to, maybe we hold off on the accounting specialist. We try to make do with the staff we have there, but we make the other changes. And then along with that, like I shared earlier, look at this current year's budget to see if there's any efficiencies we can get out of this year's budget that may be able to offset some of those costs as well for next year. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because there could be a great need, or, you know, one need might offset the other also.
Correct.
Dave, we're saying we're gonna keep the 2 reading coaches and the health and PE teacher at the high school. That's gonna remain.
Yeah, so basically what I'm saying is I'd like to do what's on that sheet except the accounting specialist, that maybe we can hold off and add that in at a future date.
Okay.
I do think it's gonna be challenging for our finance department just because of what they've taken on, but we'll try to figure out how to shift things around if we could do those other things.
Yeah, and if, I mean, you know, we will rely on your input on that because you know more, but if there are other cuts we can make somewhere else that are less impactful, like, we'll listen to your feedback.
Right, like maybe balance it out with something else.
Right, maybe we do need that, you know, so
Yeah.
we'll be, I think I'm open to hearing your feedback on that, and
Let us look at the cost for those staffing considerations in a reflection of other things where we may be able to offset costs in order to balance them out. Let us look at it from that perspective as well, and we'll bring something back to you at the next one.
Okay.
All right. I think that covered kind of all of your,
Yeah, let me double check here.
look in here. So,
Yes.
Oh, I did have one more question, and this is a quick count, but just the cost of the preliminary list of positions not eligible for state bonus, is that saying, or is that asking, should we fund these? And if so, how many thousands of dollars is that?
Correct,
And do
so,
we need to make that decision?
yeah, we can talk about that. I got a feeling at the last one, we weren't big fans of doing that. I think there's 81 positions listed there. There's ones that obviously we don't want to fund, like I don't want it, right? Like, and I'm one of the positions that doesn't qualify for the state funding. There may be some other positions that we say it's not that meaningful, but I did want you to be able to see that it does scoop in folks because of where they're assigned. They would have been scooped up in the other thing, right? So like, there are custodians that are assigned to non-school buildings that would not get the bonus, but their colleagues that are assigned to a school building would.
Yeah, that
And
doesn't
so-
feel right.
And that doesn't feel right, right?
Yeah.
So
maybe we could,
what we could do is go through and kind of put together a recommendation of a subset of these that if you wanted to fund because they have an equivalent at a school level that's getting funded by the state, and then maybe pull out those that don't have an equivalent at the school level to say, all right, we're gonna leave them out of this round for the various discussions.
I like
Makes
the way
sense
you
to me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, so we'll pull that together also next time, because we don't want employees to look to their neighbor and say, what the heck, why are they getting it when we do the exact same job? So we'll look at it from that perspective, and it should be a fairly small number when we look at it from that perspective. And we'll incorporate that in with those other staffing requests and the overall, can we find some efficiencies to cover some of this? Because remember, this is coming from the FY '21 budget.
yeah.
It's 80, okay, and the 81 right now is not in the budget.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Thank you, I had forgotten about that.
Just, yeah, anywhere that, because it's, you know, we're kind of thinking bigger picture, but anywhere where you or your staff members can bring to our attention where there might be something that just doesn't seem right or feels unfair, or we need to think through a little more, I just would appreciate bringing that to our attention. And also, like, I don't know if this is an option, but, could you do partial? Like, no one's saying here that all of these have to be 1,000, you know?
Sure,
So,
sure.
but I would want the groups to be treated,
Well, and so I'm not sure that that's gonna be an option, just because if we use the philosophy of, does your position have an equivalent that's the same position in a school,
yeah,
then that means they will be getting the $1,000.
yeah, for those. But
Oh, I
the
see what
ones
you're
that-
saying. For them, the
ones that have
others,
fallen off
okay.
completely, would we want to do something? I don't know if it would be like, a comparable percentage of what it looks like for others. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm just saying, like,
Yeah,
if there's a suggestion that makes sense,
we will look at it and see if there's something where we would say, hey, here's another possible solution to it. Yep, no
Mhm.
problem. Okay, I think that's all that I had for the budget stuff. Any other questions or comments before we jump to the policy monitor?
And my only question was about the phasing out of the remediation. And
Yeah.
we probably have discussed this before, but I didn't understand that part.
No problem. No, so, the biggest cost for the remediation stuff is the 21 teachers. And so the idea being that we've added 21 teachers into next year's budget, and then we're hoping that can be 14 teachers in the following year, 7 teachers in the following year, and then no additional teachers. But doing it through attrition, because we lose teachers every year, we hire new teachers. So not that we give those folks a limited contract, but that we are gonna phase out those positions, not the people, over time. So we
Okay.
start with the 21 next year when we're doing kind of the biggest lift of remediation, and then we cut it down by a third until we don't have that additional expense anymore. That's what I was talking about for the phasing out.
Okay. But I was just wondering, will we maintain some of these I just feel like these remediation programs are still gonna be needed. You know, the summer school and, you know, I think those are gonna be things that we still are gonna need down the
Yeah,
road.
and some of them are already there, right? So some of these remediation programs we already do, we're just ramping them up to a bigger size. So they would go back to how they were before. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think we talked about like summer school, maybe at the middle school. That's something
Right.
not currently in place. Saturday school. I guess I'm thinking about the programs that are not in place, particularly as relates to the middle school.
I mean, we can certainly add them in longer term if the board would like us to do that. That's absolutely an option. We were picturing more the really heavy lift next year to try to accelerate those students as much as possible back to where they would have been, and then easing off a little bit on it in the following years, but we can certainly look at it differently if you guys would like.
well, maybe we take that 1 year at a time and measure the benchmark where our students are and see what groups
it is quite possible that we would say, all right, right now we're planning to go from 21 to 14, and then we get to this point of next year and we say, no, we're really not comfortable with that. We still have so many needs, let's leave the 21. You know what I mean? So we're not committing to this is how it has to be. It's just for planning purposes of what we're kind of picturing happening, but of course we would check each year to see, do we still need these? Do we need to put things back in that we were planning to take out, things like that.
Did we, I'm trying to remember, did we discuss the cost of that and whether it could be reduced if some of the second instructors in the classrooms were not teachers but were paras? Did we talk about that? And because I thought that maybe we did, and maybe.
Well, at one point we were talking about using the people to reduce class sizes, but then we decided it would be better to use them in more of a early intervention program type setting. So I think that might be related to that initial discussion.
I was just wondering if the cost reflected that conversation.
So the cost reflects the change to having them be specialty teachers who are doing early intervention type programs. That's what the budget was formed around.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
Dana, are you comfortable with that, since we will revisit it each year, is it okay with you that we keep it as a phase?
Yeah, as long as we revisit it each year, because I think that there are always students who need those opportunities even before the pandemic. And,
Yep.
We have, it hasn't been too long since we got the remedial education programs at the middle school for reading and math. And so those programs, I think, are always needed and valuable. And so we might not need 21, but I think there will still be a need for more than we had before the pandemic.
Yeah, okay,
Thank you.
very good. Well, thank you all. I know that's a heavy lift. There's a lot of stuff to consider, but this was super helpful. Lanita, were there any questions you had that didn't get answered or asked?
No, thanks, some very good questions were asked today.
All right, awesome.
Thank you, Anita.
Yeah, thank you, Lanita. I really appreciated the definitions and everything. I mean, you are a phenomenal teacher. Thank you.
Thank you. That's good coming from a teacher.
Awesome. Thanks, Lanita. Great job. All right, the board policy monitoring calendar. Is it all right if I move on to that?
Oh, yeah, please do.
The board policy monitoring calendar, so we haven't actually looked at it for quite a while, but just to remind you, we decided we needed a schedule for when we would look at the various pieces of our policies. And then we decided, let's make a schedule that makes sense with what's happening in reality, right? So the administrative team built this schedule based on, like, when do we get results from assessments? When do we work on this, naturally? And then we filled in other topics where there wasn't necessarily a time that would fit at any given time. And then we also put in some work session topics of when it would make sense to have a topic for a work session, and then others we left open of, this is really an open time, we could do whatever we want with the work session. So as an example, we have our operations key performance indicators coming up at the March meeting. And so that's when our operations teams will bring you a report, but we decided because those are so in-depth, we wouldn't even try to discuss it at the March meeting. That would be more of a, here's the report. So now when we get to the work session a couple weeks later, that's when we're going to start discussing it all, so people have time to digest it a little bit. And so that's where this came from. And the other piece we talked about was sometimes we don't need to actually talk about it in a meeting or in a work session. We just need to know that that report is being done. And so that third column, or I guess fourth column, the last column. What's that?
I'm not seeing this.
Oh, sorry, I'm looking off the attachment. Would you mind pulling that up, Eston?
Okay, I can open the attachment.
Yeah, from the board agenda, the monitoring calendar.
Sorry, I can go there.
The final column is when is the report posted? So when do we expect to get results for various things and post the reports for those so that you know when they're available, but they're not necessarily something we're going to be talking about in any given meeting. So that was the gist of the policy monitoring. There's some definitions down there at the bottom of what the different things mean and whatnot, but, that's the gist of it. We are trying now to get back on the schedule, so in February, we did our district improvement plan update. You heard from Maggie and some others on that, the 4 doctors. And then, like I said, this coming meeting, we're gonna talk about operation KPIs, and then in April, we'll do another district improvement plan update. So that's kind of where we are. We will plan to follow this schedule, until we wanna make changes. So obviously, some of these things are gonna change because we're not gonna have some of these assessment results, for instance, coming into August and September. Some of those might not even exist because of the pandemic, but those that do will plan to follow the schedule.
My concern about this is that it seems, I think it's incomplete, like very incomplete in terms of what we need to be doing. We've, as you know, and maybe not everybody does, but we've gone to this less prescriptive policy governance model that we've only half implemented, where we give broad direction to you and then set some broad goals and broad parameters. But then the only way that works is if we on a regular basis go check in and say, how is it that you're complying with each of these goals and objectives that we've set? And it's not just the test assessment. You know, it's throughout. What are you doing in terms of the health and wellness plan that we for a while had a lot of discussion about, but where is that in terms of its implementation? Where's the equity plan? Well, we talked about that at the last meeting, but that's another one. What are we doing about the, you know, the whole child aspect that goes beyond the testing? And there's a lot of goals around making sure that people get, you know, those aspects developed as well. There's a lot of stuff. You know, go back to the staff grievance policies. There's a policy that requires that those be in place. I think they might actually need to be revisited. And the only way that we can keep on top of our business is to have a regular schedule in which these things are presented, and we actually are doing our jobs by checking to make sure that things that we said were going to happen are happening. And we started this and you know, couldn't even agree on the form of a report. It turned into this 3-phase kind of a thing where y'all would come in the first instance at phase 1 and say, here are the criteria that we're going to use to assess ourselves against, you know, basically the SMART goals, I guess. And here's the form of the report. We would have a discussion about it. Once that was set, there'd then be kind of a draft report, and then we'd have a final report. We've never even made it to the end of a single report. And so at a minimum, I just think it's imperative that we get back on a schedule and have every single one of those. And a lot of them can be knocked off pretty quickly because it's literally, to some extent, checking boxes. You know, do you have the equity plan in place? Yes, we've done it. Did you actually complete the work on the staff grievance policy? It's not clear to me that we did. And so if we didn't, we need to understand that that's hanging out there and put it on a schedule to get it done. But it needs to be systematic. It needs to be deliberate. We've let it go for the past year, but I just think it's time to get back on the schedule. That's my view.
We had some good schedule. I think it looked different than this back in our board meeting agendas from last spring. And weren't we also linking to ARs?
Well, so, yeah, so let me respond. So
Okay.
the idea of this calendar was exactly what Louis just described. We just haven't listed out the specific policies of each thing. So the safety, security, and emergency preparedness is one of the sections in our board policy manual. The staff recruitment, retention, diversity, that's a section in our board policy manual. So these came from the board policy manual, and maybe what we need to do is put in the numbers that they represent. Maybe that would be helpful, because that's where they came from. They came out of like, so the dip is largely about the end policies, right? Like, how are we going to achieve the ends that we intend to achieve? The other reports you see there come from the executive limitations policies. How are we going to comply with each of those executive limitations? So these do come directly from the board policy manual. Maybe we just need to make that more explicit so it's really clear. But at one
think
point,
that-
we had talked about our other way of doing it was way too complex and people couldn't understand what we were doing. And I think maybe the pendulum swung too far to trying to simplify it so people could see what the plan is. Maybe we need to fall somewhere in between.
Yeah,
I
I think making the connection is good, and this might be a great topic for a retreat, which I think we're long overdue to have.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking for the benefit especially of James and Jana, there was years of conversation around this before we actually got to this point. And I remember it started when I started on the board, or it was in its early phases when I started on the board. And so I think it'll be really helpful to give more context, but it's gonna be a bigger discussion, which it sounds like to me.
So I agree, and I do think I think that we have to do some retreat and kind of development around this that we just haven't done. And I'm happy to hear that this is connected more systematically to the policy manual than as a parent. I do think that going back, what I think would make sense would be, on the one hand, what you've already done, is that you pull out and say, here's all the monitoring reports that need to be submitted. And I think that we've got a chart that says this is going to be done annually. In some cases, we don't even need to report annually. I think in some cases there might have been a longer reporting. But the presumption is that there's one report per year. Just list them out. And if they're going to be combined in topics, you can just show. But we need to be able to see that we're doing our job by saying, here are all the reports that are needed, and here's when it's going to get done. Just so if you could provide that checklist for us so we can draw the lines, to me, that would help.
Yeah, we can definitely do that.
And so Heather brought up too, potentially creating some sort of safe retreat option. So just wanted to see how everybody felt about that. And still maybe offer a virtual option for those who may not feel comfortable. But doing it maybe even where we've always done it, because they have that huge outside space. So we could still have something outside where we're not sitting inside all day. And we could be kind of apart like we are here. But I think we definitely need to try to get back to that, because we learned so much from each other. And we just have that chance to really dig deep into things that we are unable to dig really deep into. And I think this is one subject that we could really spend some good quality time on. So if everybody is amenable to some form of a retreat, like I said, it's not going to quite probably look like it's always looked, but I think that there's a way we could make it work. Then maybe we could get some dates out there and have Shana start working on that and seeing. But just wanted to get anybody's thoughts on what you think about that.
All for it. I think it's important.
I agree.
And we can start working on looking at potential locations, because I'm sure these places have also had to think about how do you handle these things safely. So we can explore what are some options, so we can let you guys know even what the options are that are out there, as well as trying to finalize some dates, and we can definitely make that happen.
Jana, James, what do you guys think?
Dana, you're
I'm
muted.
Jana.
Once I get this shut, I'll be ready to do, whatever. Right now, I'm still a little nervous about, being with a group of people. But so if there was a virtual option, that would be great. If I get the shot between now and then I'm all good.
Perfect. All right. Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Great.
All right.
Anything else on monitoring calendar stuff?
I think I'm good there. Is there any other items anyone needed to bring up? Good. All right.
That's it. So, awesome. I will try to write all this up and share with you what we think our marching orders are, so you guys can correct me if we missed anything, and we will be, do our best to bring it to our March meeting, a much different budget with all those things that we talked about. And we'll work on the monitoring calendar and some of that specificity and getting the retreat planned and all that kind of stuff.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That ends our work session at 9:11.
Have a good night, guys.
Thanks, everybody.